The APS has a history of not learning and apparently not wanting to learn how to do anything differently than what it does. This represents an opportunity for the APS school board to start learning, okay, how to really go about improving the quality of teaching and learning in the Atlanta public schools. The circumstances seem ideal to do that. Okay, closing schools and moving children around inherently has nothing to do with improving teaching and learning. And if it doesn't, then why are we doing it? I've been looking at data for a long time, and the data substantiate that, yes, there's a North Atlanta public school system and then there's a South Atlanta public school system, okay? And the two really haven't been concerned about each other's fate unless they felt some impact to themselves, okay? The recent CRCT cheating crisis is an excellent example of that, okay? Basically, the North Side didn't get involved until they became threatened with the loss of APS accreditation. Okay. Now, I hope a lesson has been learned from that, that we simply can't sit back and say, well, that's not my problem. Okay. That's y'all's problem. Okay. But the reality is, we need to go forward in such a way that we do bring everybody together. Okay. And we need to appeal to everyone's sense of the common good. Okay. There's this idea of the sustainability of democratic ideals and service to the public good, which is something I greatly adhere to. Now, you're not going to have common good if you're pursuing your own personal interests. Now, on the North Side, their situation is different than on the South Side. On the North Side, it's basically overpopulation, okay, in the schools, and on the South Side, it's underpopulation. Ideally, you could balance the two out. But our cultural traditions at this point is in the way of accomplishing that. So you do have people advocating for their own interests and people not necessarily advocating for their own interests. But at the end of the day, okay, at the end of the day, if we don't recognize that we're all in the same boat here, okay, we will continue to operate in two different systems, and that won't serve the city of Atlanta well at all. The APS has in fact put out a 10-year plan starting next year, okay, and it is based upon the demographic projections that the demographers did for APS. And it takes a look at the demographics for the various clusters that Superintendent Davis wants to institute for Atlanta Public Schools, okay. The North Side has a cluster, and that's the way it has pretty much operated for quite a while, and he wants to implement that idea on the South Side. Now, the idea of a cluster is very simple. You take your elementary schools and you feed them into a certain middle school, and you feed that middle school into a high school, okay? Now, overall, the total population in each of these schools is projected to increase. However, when you take a look at the data, okay, along the diagonal in the data, and by diagonal I mean if you take the first year, grades 0 through 3, and follow that diagonal all the way through the 12th grade, grades 9 through 12 in the 10th year, you see some interesting projections, okay? For example, if we take a look at Carver from year 1 to year 10 of the plan is projected to lose 25% of its students, or 432 of them. The Best Academy and Coretta Scott King is projected to lose 28% of its students, or 304 of them, okay? And Douglas is projected to lose a whopping 61% of its students, or 488 of them, okay? Now, what's interesting is when we get to look at Mays is projected to gain 19% in students, or 313 of them. So that should beg the question, are we planning, well, why, first of all, would APS plan for a high school to lose so many students? Why would they do that? That's a question, okay? And the other question with respect to Mays in comparison to the other high schools, that begs the question, well, are they planning to close high schools after the 10-year plan because they are underpopulated? See, these are the kinds of questions that, by looking at the data, and I'm not sure the school board or even the superintendent has looked at what's buried in the data in this manner, but those are the kinds of questions that if we don't if we fail to be, if we prove to be irresponsible today by closing these schools, the 10 that are slated to be closed, if we do that, then a natural consequence is to set up conditions so that we close these high schools later. And we end up with just Mays, with Darrell closed, Douglas closed, and maybe some of the high schools closed. So we need to put a stop to this right now, which is one argument for not closing the schools. I think we are all familiar with, or at least have heard of, the Obama administration's race to the top competition. And it is a competition. I mean, just think of that. Our federal government subjecting the various states in a competition to get money for public education. Just think of that. Think of what that means. And think of just how counter that is to the idea of sustaining democratic ideas and service to the public good. Okay. Now, the states, Georgia being one of them, won in the race to the top competition, won some money, on the condition that, well, there are several conditions, but one of those conditions is to increase the number of charter schools. Can you imagine that? NAEP is recognized as the nation's report card. Now, you can take data and you can spin it in a way that you want to tell the kind of story that you want to. And one of the stories that the computer data have been used to tell about is that it's improving. Okay. Now, this story is based in a very narrow, reductionistic kind of way. It is not a systemic assessment. Okay. Now, when you take those tutor data from NAEP and you look at them in a systemic kind of way, you discover not only has Atlanta not improved over the 10 years, but none of the major urban districts that are participating in the tutor have either. Okay, they've all been on the same boat since about 2002, 2003, depending upon the subject area being tested. And the only thing that has changed is the arrangement of the deck chairs. Okay, today Atlanta was here on the deck of the Titanic. Last year it was here. Okay, the year before it was here. But they have all been on the Titanic, and nothing from a systemic standpoint has been done to improve the Titanic, to improve its hull, such that when it strikes that iceberg, it will still stay afloat. Nothing. So our public education systems, including Atlanta now, are headed towards the iceberg, thinking that our hull, when it hits that iceberg, is going to hold, and it's not. I really dislike anybody being made a loser. Okay? And I see that our public education systems operate in such a way that they produce too many losers and too few winners. And that doesn't have to be. And I know that it doesn't have to be. It happens only because of our paradigms, the way we think. There are other ways of thinking that says we can produce as many winners as we can and as few losers as we can. And my whole thing is to try to help, especially the Atlanta public school system, to understand or to open themselves up to learning how to do that. Okay. An example of how we produce so many losers and so few winners hit me really hard when I was asked to be a judge in a social science fair contest at one of the Atlanta middle schools. To prepare myself for the judging, I arrived maybe 30 minutes later to review the entries that were on display. And I was just surprised and a sense of joy filled me with seeing the wonderful work that these kids had done. Okay, so I go into the judging, and of course we create one winner, one first place winner, second place winner, third place winner. And then all of a sudden I didn't like what I had done. That I had taken these 30 kids and contributed to making 27 of them losers. Why did I do that? I did that out of ignorance. Okay? I did that not understanding that instead of competition, how about collaboration? How about these kids? How about helping these kids to understand how they could work together to benefit each other, as opposed to teaching them that life is about getting ahead at the expense of somebody else. Now just think how that lesson can play out in some other kinds of situations, okay? Just think of how that can play out in terms of crime rate, okay? The idea that I've been so deeply inculcated into, well, you don't matter, what matters is me. Therefore, if you're in my way, I'm going to do what I need to do to get you out of my way so I can get what I want. Okay, so our school systems, that caused me to really open up to seeing that a lot of what goes on in our school system really is indeed set up to produce far too many losers and far too many winners when the world today needs all the winners it can get. Now the same thing happens to teachers, okay? The administrations in too many of our school systems think an effective teacher is one who ranks at the top. An ineffective teacher is one who ranks at the bottom. Ranking simply demonstrates a lack of knowledge and understanding about systems. Remember, the components of the system work together for the benefit of the whole, okay? If we have administrations that are forcing teachers into ranking situations, in other words, saying, teachers, we are going to make you want to get ahead at the expense of your other teachers. Can you imagine the consequences, not only to the teachers, but to the kids and their learning? Okay, so these are the kinds of things that we've got to start waking up to, okay, got to.